The day Mallory Vance stood at the gate of my bee yard and called it a nuisance that was dragging down the value of her resort, she had no idea this ground was here long before her gated community existed. My name is Calvin Rains, and I am a black man who keeps bees on land my own family paid for, yet she spoke to me the way you speak to hired help who needs to be taught manners. She filed a formal complaint with the county to force me to clear out my hives. That complaint made an inspector reopen the resort file, and what he found was enough to erase every land approval they had. If you want to watch Mallory turn her own contempt into a multi-million-dollar disaster, subscribe and stay with me to the very end. Most mornings I am awake before the light finds the tree line, and I like it that way. There is a stillness out here right before the hives wake up, a low hum that starts in the boxes closest to the creek and spreads west across the whole yard like water finding a slope. I make coffee in a dented pot, pull on the same canvas jacket I have worn for 11 seasons, and walk the rows barefoot in my boots without socks because the leather is shaped to my feet by now. 140 colonies, 18 acres, no mortgage, no lien, no partner holding paper over my head. My grandfather bought this ground in the 1950s when nobody wanted it, and my father kept it through 2 decades when keeping it cost more than selling it would have paid. I am not a poor man, and I have never pretended to be one. Rains Apiary sells honey to 3 specialty grocers, 2 bakeries, and a distillery that uses my wildflower crop for a small batch mead, and in the spring I move pallets of hives out to almond and apple growers who pay well for pollination because their yields collapse without it. I keep clean books, I file my taxes early, and I own a truck that is 15 years old because I like it, not because I cannot afford another. What I do not own is a wardrobe designed to convince strangers I belong here. I wear work clothes because I work, and I have learned over the years that some people read a pair of stained coveralls the way other people read a credit report. Before all of this, I spent 9 years as a land survey technician, running boundary crews across 4 counties, staking corners and pulling old deeds out of basements that smelled like mildew and mouse nests. I learned to read a plat map the way other men read a newspaper. I learned that lines on paper are not descriptions of the world, they are arguments about the world, and that whoever draws them first usually wins. I came home when my father got sick, took over the bees to keep myself busy through that first hard winter, and then discovered I liked the work more than anything I had done with a transit and a tripod. I never expected that old training to matter again. It mattered more than anything else in this story. Cedar Hollow Estates went up 17 years after I took over the apiary. First came the surveyors, then the graders, then a stone entrance with a bronze plaque and 2 lantern posts that stay lit all night. The development wrapped around 2 sides of my property like a hand closing partway around a stone, close enough that I could hear their sprinklers running at 4 in the morning, but my parcel was never inside it. Different zoning, different plat, different chain of title. My 18 acres sit under agricultural and rural use designation that predates every one of those houses, and no homeowners association has 1 word of authority over a blade of grass on it. That distinction seemed like paperwork trivia for a long time. It turned out to be the spine of everything. Then last spring the equipment started up on the far side of the tree line to the east, and by summer I could see the shape of what was coming. Cedar Hollow Resort and Spa. A timber and stone lodge, 40 guest cabins staggered across a hillside, a spa wing with a glass solarium, a 9-hole executive golf course, and an event pavilion big enough for 200 people at round tables. The advertising panels along the county road promised a private retreat in unspoiled countryside, which struck me as a strange way to describe a place they were currently clearing with excavators. I did not mind them. My bees did not mind them either. Construction dust settles, noise stops at dusk, and 140 colonies do not care about architecture. Mallory Vance came the 2nd week of July. I heard the vehicle before I saw it, a white SUV moving too fast on gravel, and I set down the frame I was inspecting and walked toward the gate wiping propolis off my gloves. She got out in cream slacks and a linseed blazer, sunglasses pushed up into hair that had been arranged by somebody who charges by the hour, and she looked past me at the honey house and the equipment shed and the rows of boxes running down toward the creek. Then she looked at me. She did not say hello. She did not ask if I was Calvin Rain. She said, "Is the owner of this property here?" I told her she was speaking to him. There was a pause then, maybe 2 full seconds, and I watched her eyes drop to my boots and travel back up across the coveralls, and the smoker hanging off my belt and land somewhere around my collar. "You own all of this," she said, and it was not a question so much as a request for correction. I said yes, all 18 acres, and my family before me. She recovered fast, I will give her that, but not fast enough that either of us could pretend the pause had not happened. That was the first signal, and it was a clear one. She had priced me at a glance, and the number had come back low. She introduced herself then as Mallory Vance, president of the Cedar Hollow Estates Homeowners Association, and explained that the resort would be receiving its first guests in the fall. She said the community had worked very hard to establish a certain standard, that the resort represented a significant investment in the area, and that large-scale beekeeping operations were not consistent with the image being built here. She used the phrase visual coherence. She used the phrase guest experience. She said she was sure I understood that everyone benefits when property values rise, and she said it in the tone of a woman explaining arithmetic to a child who has already gotten it wrong once. I said it was lucky for me that I am not part of her community. She did not care for that. Her mouth went flat and she looked at the hive boxes again as if they had personally offended her, and I could see her rearranging whatever plan she had arrived with. She said she had hoped to handle this neighbor to neighbor. I told her I was happy to be a neighbor and that neighbors do not usually open with instructions. She put her sunglasses back down, walked to the SUV, and opened the door before she turned around. "We will see what the county thinks about that," she said. She came back 9 days later, and this time she brought a man with her. He introduced himself as Grant Holloway of Holloway Ridge Development, 52 years old, silver at the temples, the kind of handshake that has closed a lot of deals in a lot of parking lots. He wore no tie, and he asked permission before stepping through my gate, which is more courtesy than I had gotten from Mallory in 2 visits combined. He said he had heard there was a misunderstanding and he wanted to hear it from me directly. I gave him 10 minutes of my time and a bottle of water out of the cooler in the honey house, and for the first stretch of that conversation I thought this might end reasonably. Grant said the resort and the apiary could coexist, that he had no objection to agriculture as a concept, and then he arrived at what he had actually come to ask. He wanted me to relocate the hives deeper into my property, away from the eastern boundary, out of sight of the cabins on the ridge. Failing that, he said, his company would consider purchasing the strip of my land that ran along the resort side, roughly at market rate, a clean transaction with no hard feelings. He said it the way you offer somebody a favor. I asked which strip specifically, and he pointed to exactly the ground I would never sell. That eastern edge is where my clover and my basswood and my wild aster grow thickest, fed by the creek and shaded in the afternoon, and it is the reason my wildflower honey tastes like something instead of tasting like sugar water. Move the hives a quarter-mile west and I lose forage range, I lose the creek as a water source, and I lose the shelter belt that keeps my colonies from taking the full brunt of the winter wind off the open fields. I explained all of that plainly, without heat, the way I would explain it to anybody who asked. Grant listened and nodded and seemed to understand. Mallory did not listen at all. She said Cedar Hollow was trying to elevate this area. She said guests paying $2,000 for a weekend do not want to look out over a field of weathered wooden crates. She said, and I am quoting her exactly because I wrote it down that evening, "You may call this a business, but from the resort side it looks like a pile of clutter." I told her the apiary was licensed, registered with the state, inspected on schedule, and operating under agricultural zoning that had been in place since before her subdivision was platted. "Calvin," she said, "I do not need a lecture about bees." I noticed the name. She had used my first name 3 times by then, easy and casual, while she had corrected Grant once already for calling her Mallory instead of Mrs. Vance. Small thing. Small things stack. I have been in enough rooms in my life to know exactly what it means when somebody hands you their title and takes your surname away, and I have learned not to argue about it because arguing gives them the pleasure of watching you notice. I let it sit. I filed it with the pause at the gate and the question about whether the owner was around. Instead, I turned to Grant and asked him something that had been forming in my mind since he pointed at my eastern strip. I asked when the resort had actually acquired its land. He said something about phased assembly. I asked which year the parcel closest to my line went under his company's control. He said he would have to check with his title people. I asked whether the survey they had used for their site plan was new or inherited from an earlier owner, and that is when he looked at his watch and said he had a call. Mallory was already walking back to the SUV. I stood at the gate afterward, turning it over, not suspicious yet, just aware that a developer who can quote you a price per acre without hesitating had suddenly lost his memory about a boundary. The letter arrived 11 days after that in a heavy envelope with the Cedar Hollow Estates crest embossed on the flap, Norder of Nuisance in capital letters across the top of the first page. It cited 3 sections of a covenant document I have never signed, described my apiary as an ongoing detriment to the aesthetic and economic interests of the association, and gave me 14 days to correct the nuisance or face escalation. It was signed by Mallory Vance, President. I laughed out loud standing at my own mailbox, because you cannot cite covenants at a man who lives outside your fence any more than you can ticket a boat for speeding on a highway. Then I saw the line at the bottom of the second page and I stopped laughing. Copy transmitted to County Planning and Land Use Department. She had not just written me a threatening letter for her own satisfaction. She had gone and put the county government in the middle of it on the record with her signature on the paper. The complaints began within the week and they came in volume. Truck noise from deliveries, which meant one flat bed twice a month. Bees appearing near the resort construction site, which is what bees do within a 2-mile radius of anywhere. Smoke odor from my smoker, which burns pine needles and burlap and puts out less haze than a charcoal grill. Hive boxes described as inconsistent with landscape character. And the one they leaned on hardest, the risk of resort guests being stung by aggressive insects, filed by people whose own flower beds were doing more to attract my bees than my hives ever did. Then Mallory invited me to a meeting. The email called it an opportunity to resolve concerns amicably in a community setting, which is a phrase that has never once in the history of the world meant what it says. My lawyer instinct, which I did not have yet, would have told me to stay home. I went because I had learned something long ago on survey crews, which is that when people are building a story about you, it is better to be in the room while they build it. The clubhouse held maybe 60 people that night in rows of folding chairs facing a projector screen with a table at the front for the board. Mallory ran it like a woman who has run a lot of meetings. She got through the landscaping budget and the pool resurfacing bid in 9 minutes flat, and then she said now on the matter of the agricultural operation adjacent to our eastern boundary and clicked to the next slide. It was a photograph of my bee yard, taken with a long lens from somewhere on the resort ridge, shot in flat gray light so the boxes looked stained and the grass looked dead. She left it up on the screen for a long time. Nobody said anything. She told the room that Cedar Hollow homeowners had invested millions of dollars to make this a community worth living in, and that one business could not be allowed to hold an entire neighborhood back. She used the word blight twice. She said the resort's marketing partners had raised questions about sight lines, which I doubted, and that a prospective buyer had walked away from a listing on the eastern cul-de-sac which she did not document. Then she opened the floor for questions with the photograph still glowing on the screen behind her. I asked whether she meant the business that had been operating there 17 years before her neighborhood existed. Being there first, she said, does not make it appropriate. I remember the exact quality of the quiet that followed because it was not the quiet of people agreeing with her, it was the quiet of people doing arithmetic. A man in the third row asked me how long I had been leasing the ground out there, and before I could get a syllable out, Mallory answered for me. Mr. Raines operates an apiary on that acreage, she said. Operates, not owns. She had made that choice deliberately, and she had made it in front of 60 of her neighbors, and I understood in that moment that she had been telling this story to people for weeks and telling it with that word in it. So I stood up. I said, I do not operate an apiary on anybody's land. I own the land. 18 acres in my family since 1954, held free and clear outside your association under agricultural zoning that was recorded before the first shovel went into the ground out here. You can look it up at the county in about 4 minutes. The room went very still. Mallory said, "Thank you, Calvin," and moved immediately to the next agenda item, and a woman near the back said something to the man beside her that I could not hear. I sat back down and stayed to the end because leaving would have looked like a retreat. When it broke up, people avoided me the way people do when they are embarrassed for somebody else, and I was almost to the parking lot when a man I had seen at the board table caught up with me. Dean Prescott, 62, retired, one of the first buyers in Cedar Hollow, and by his own admission a man who had voted with Mallory on almost everything for 6 years. He shook my hand and said he had not known the ownership situation, which I believed. Then he lowered his voice and looked back toward the clubhouse doors. "If I were you," he said, "I would take a look at the resort site plan they filed with the county." I asked him what I would be looking for. He said he was not certain, that he had sat through 2 presentations and something about the acreage figures had never added up in his head, and that he had asked once and been told it was a technical matter. Then he said good night and walked to his car, and that was the whole conversation. It took under a minute. I did not believe him at first because Dean had spent 6 years backing the woman who had just put my property on a screen. But I had spent 9 years staking boundaries for a living, and there is a particular itch that comes when somebody tells you an acreage figure does not add up. By Thursday, I was in the county records office at 9 in the morning with a legal pad. I pulled 4 things: the subdivision plat for Cedar Hollow Estates, my own chain of title back through my grandfather's purchase, the recorded site plan for Cedar Hollow Resort and Spa, and the conditional land use approval the county had granted the resort 18 months earlier with all its attached exhibits. The clerk brought them out in 2 flat boxes, and I spread them across a table by the window and started at the beginning the way you do, checking the easy things first. There was a hatched green region along the western edge of the resort property labeled in small type, permanent agricultural and open space buffer. The legend gave its area as 12.9 acres, and the shape of it was familiar to me in a way that made my hands go cold on the paper because I had walked that shape 10,000 times. The kink where the creek bends, the notch where the old fence line steps around a rock outcrop, the long tapering point at the southwest corner where my grandfather's parcel narrows toward the county road. It was my land, nearly 13 of my 18 acres, drawn inside their plan, colored as part of their project, counted in their numbers. I sat with that for a long time. Then I went back through the approval conditions with a completely different set of eyes, and I found what that green area was doing for them. It satisfied the minimum open space ratio required for a commercial resort use in a rural district. It provided the mandatory separation distance between commercial structures and adjacent agricultural operations. It brought their overall development density down under the approved ceiling by adding acreage to the denominator. And it served as the environmental and drainage protection zone the county requires along a perennial creek. 4 separate conditions, all resting on ground that belonged to me. I made copies of everything, paid the clerk $9, and drove into town to find a lawyer. Warren Keene was 57 and had a second-floor office above a hardware store with a window unit that rattled. Land law, water rights, boundary disputes, 30 years of it. I put the documents on his desk in order and told him the story in about 6 minutes without editorializing, and he did not interrupt once. Then he put his glasses on and went through it himself, slowly, tracing the green region with a pencil eraser and flipping back to my deed twice to confirm the metes and bounds. He spent 2 days on it before he called me back in. "There is no recorded easement," he said. "Nothing in your chain of title, nothing in theirs, nothing filed with the county granting Cedar Hollow or Holloway Ridge any right to use your acreage as open space, buffer, drainage protection, or anything else. No lease, no development rights agreement, no option, no right of first refusal." He turned the deed around so it faced me, and no signature from you or your father or your grandfather on anything resembling a conveyance. I asked him what that meant practically. He said it meant their approval was standing on air, and that the county had almost certainly never checked, because counties rarely check whether an applicant actually controls the land the applicant claims to control. They take the site plan as submitted. That is the whole system. It works until somebody has a reason to look. Then Warren leaned back in his chair and looked at me over his glasses with something like amusement working at the corner of his mouth. "Calvin," he said, "do you know what the funniest part of this is?" I told him I did not. If the association had never filed that nuisance complaint, he said nobody on earth would have had a reason to reopen the file on your parcel. Not this year, not in 10 years, maybe never. That green area sits there quietly until somebody pulls the drawer open. She pulled the drawer open herself. Tessa Monroe came out on a Tuesday morning, 41 years old, county planner, khakis and a field vest, a tablet in a rubberized cape. She was polite and completely neutral in a way I appreciated, the kind of person who tells you up front what she is authorized to do and then does exactly that. She said she was there to evaluate a nuisance complaint regarding an agricultural operation and to verify compliance with the county code, that she was not there to mediate a dispute, and that her findings would go into a written report regardless of who liked them. Mallory arrived 4 minutes later. She had not been invited by me and she was not required to be there, and she parked her SUV across from my gate and walked over to stand beside Tessa with a folder under her arm. She was in good spirits. You could see it in how she carried herself, the small satisfied set of her shoulders, and I understood that in her mind this was the morning it all paid off. She said twice in the first 10 minutes, "This is precisely what we have been reporting." Tessa worked methodically and ignored her. She measured the distance from my nearest hive to the eastern property line and wrote it down. She checked the second and third rows, the water source at the creek, and the shallow basins I keep filled so the bees do not go looking for a neighbor's pool. She photographed my posted warning signs at both gates. She asked for my state registration, my last inspection report, and my agricultural use verification, and I handed all 3 over in a folder because I had assembled it 2 weeks earlier. She looked at the flight paths, noted the height of the shelter belt, and walked the eastern boundary herself for about 200 yards. Then she stood in the middle of the yard with her tablet and said there were no substantive violations. Setbacks exceeded the minimum, water provision compliant, signage compliant, registration and inspections current, colony density well within the allowance for the acreage. She said the operation constituted a lawful agricultural use on land zoned for lawful agricultural use, and that the complaint items regarding aesthetics and hive appearance had no basis in the county code because the code does not regulate what a beehive looks like. Mallory's voice changed, "So he is simply permitted," she said, "to keep hundreds of thousands of insects next to a resort." Tessa answered without any edge in it at all, which somehow made it land harder. "Ma'am," she said, "the resort was built next to an agricultural parcel. The agricultural parcel did not appear next to the resort. Priority of use matters in this county, and it is not a close question here." I went into the honey house and came back out with the folder from the county records office. I asked Tessa if she had a few more minutes. Then I unfolded the resort site plan across the tailgate of my truck, put my finger on the hatched green region along the western edge, and asked her a very simple question. "Can you tell me why my parcel is inside this?" Mallory cut in immediately. "That is not relevant to today's inspection." Tessa looked at her, then she looked at me, and then down at the drawing, and I watched her face do the thing my face had done in the records office 3 weeks earlier. She asked me to say that again. I said the 12.9-acre buffer on their approved site plan is my land, and I have never granted anyone the right to use it. She asked if I was the owner of record. I handed her the certified copy of the deed and the plat and my agricultural use verification with the parcel number printed on it, and she stood there comparing the legal description to the drawing for what must have been 3 full minutes without saying a word. Grant Holloway got there in under half an hour. He came up the drive fast, got out with his phone still in his hand, and I watched him look at the site plan spread on my tailgate and go a shade I can only describe as gray. He said the buffer designation came out of the original assemblage survey. Tessa asked whether his company held any recorded interest in the parcel. He said he would need to consult his title counsel. She asked the same question a second time, more slowly. He gave the same answer. Tessa closed her tablet. "I need to refer this to Land Development Review," she said. "Why?" Mallory asked. "Because if Mr. Raines has not granted the applicant use of this acreage," Tessa said, "then we have a problem with the resort's approval itself." The whole thing turned over on that sentence. 9 days later, Grant Holloway came to see me alone, no Mallory, no lawyer, driving a pickup instead of the German sedan he had brought the first time. He sat on the tailgate of my truck and drank a bottle of water and talked to me like a man rather than a hurdle. He said the site plan had been prepared from an earlier survey package that came with the land assembly, that his firm's planners had carried the buffer designation forward without independently verifying control of the acreage, and that what had occurred was an administrative misunderstanding. I asked him whether a 13-acre administrative misunderstanding was a category he ran into often. He had the decency to laugh at that briefly, and then he got to the offer. Holloway Ridge would purchase a permanent conservation easement over the western portion of my parcel, keeping it in agricultural and open space use, which he pointed out was exactly what I was already doing with it. He named a figure. It was low enough that I understood he was starting a negotiation rather than making a serious proposal, and it was also beside the point. I told him no, and I told him why, because I did not want him leaving with the idea that this was about money. A permanent easement would restrict how that ground could be used forever, by me and by anybody who comes after me. It would cap the number of colonies I could run. It would foreclose putting up another honey house, or a cold storage building, or a second access road. It would hand a resort corporation a recorded interest in my family's land in exchange for a check I did not need, so that a development company would not have to redraw a plan it should have drawn correctly in the first place. My grandfather bought this ground so that nobody would ever have a say in it but us. Selling that for a fence and a nice figure was not a trade I was going to make. Mallory came 4 days after Grant. She parked outside the gate this time and did not come through it, and she was not quite the woman who had stood there in July. Not humble, just recalculating. She said she wanted to speak candidly, and then she said the sentence I have thought about more than any other in this whole business. "Calvin, we both know your bee yard is not worth delaying a project of this scale over." There it was, complete and undisguised. Even standing in the wreckage of her own complaint, she was still weighing my thing against her thing on a scale she had built herself, and mine still came up light. I said, "The problem was never my bees. The problem is my land." She said she was prepared to make it right. The association would withdraw every complaint and issue a written retraction. They would pay for a new perimeter fence along the eastern line, cedar, whatever style I wanted. The resort would contract to buy my honey for the lodge and the gift shop at a good wholesale rate. In exchange, I would sign the easement immediately this week before the county review moved any further. I asked her a question instead of answering. I asked whether it had ever occurred to anyone, at any point in 18 months of planning and approvals and marketing, to ask my permission before putting my property inside their drawing. "Do not make this personal," she said. "You made it personal," I told her, "the day you stood at my gate and asked where the owner was while you were looking right at him. You made it personal when you told 60 of your neighbors that I operate an apiary out here instead of telling them I own it, because owning it made me a harder story to tell. I have been outside your fence this whole time, Mrs. Vance. You were the one who kept reaching over it. Her jaw set, she got back in the SUV and rolled the window down before she pulled away. If this resort loses its approval, she said, several hundred homeowners are going to know exactly whose fault it was. I think they should know, I said. The email went out to the community 2 days later. A local landowner, it said, was obstructing the resort expansion and jeopardizing years of community investment through an unwillingness to cooperate on a routine boundary matter. It did not mention the nuisance complaint. It did not mention that the association had spent 2 months trying to shut my business down, or that the county had come out at Mallory's own request and found nothing wrong, or that the boundary matter was routine only in the sense that they had routinely assumed my land was theirs. My name was not in it. Everybody knew who it meant. Then Tessa Monroe found the other thing. She had gone back through the conditional approval line by line, all 41 pages, and in the conditions of the original grant she found requirement written in language nobody had paid attention to for 18 months. The designated open space and agricultural buffer shall remain under the legal control of the applicant for the operational life of the project. Not shown on the plan, not depicted, under legal control, for the entire operational life of the resort. That changed the shape of the problem completely, and Warren explained it to me at his kitchen table on a Saturday because I did not entirely follow it at first. A mistake on a drawing can sometimes be cured by amending the drawing, he said. But this was not only a drawing error, this was a condition precedent. The approval had been issued on the express requirement that the applicant control that acreage, and the applicant had never controlled it, not for 1 day, not for 1 hour. The foundation the approval stood on had never actually been built. You cannot amend your way out of a condition that was never satisfied in the first place. The county issued a notice of administrative review 11 days later. All pending building permits for the resort's remaining phases were frozen, effective immediately, with the lodge and the first cabin cluster allowed to continue only because they were already framed and inspected. The event pavilion stopped. The spa wing stopped. The second and third cabin clusters stopped. I drove past on a Wednesday and there were 6 pieces of idle equipment sitting on a graded pad with nobody on site. Mallory called an emergency association meeting. I went, and this time nobody had to invite me. I had brought 3 documents, my deed, their site plan, and the nuisance complaint letter with her signature on the bottom of the second page. I did not make a speech. I have never been a speechmaker, and pretending otherwise that night would have wrecked it. I said I did not call the county out to Cedar Hollow. Your association president did that in writing on association letterhead, and I have the copy she sent me. She asked them to inspect my land. They inspected it, and they found my operation entirely lawful, and while they were out there they saw 13 acres of my property drawn inside the resort's approved plan with no easement, no lease, and no signature from me anywhere in the county records. That is the whole story. Everything that has happened since happened because of the letter she sent. I held up the letter so the back rows could see the letterhead, and I set all 3 documents on the table at the front and sat down. Dean Prescott stood up. He asked Mallory directly whether the board had known that the resort's open space calculation relied on land owned by somebody south of the association. She said the site plan had been prepared by licensed professionals. He asked her again whether the board had known. She said the board had reviewed the presentations provided to it. A woman 2 rows ahead of me said, "That is not an answer," loud enough for the room, and there was a sound from the crowd that I can only call the noise a group of people make when they collectively stop giving somebody the benefit of the doubt. Grant Holloway was there, and he did something interesting. When a homeowner asked him whether the association had been involved in preparing the site plan, he said Holloway Ridge takes sole responsibility for the contents of its own filings, and that the association had no role in the technical submissions. It sounded like accountability. It was a man stepping off a sinking boat onto a dock. From that night forward, the developer and the association were no longer telling the same story, and I understood that Mallory had just lost the only ally who could have made her version hold together. The public review hearing came 6 weeks later in the county building downtown on a Thursday afternoon in a room with bad fluorescent lighting and folding chairs along the back wall for the overflow. There were maybe 90 people there. Nobody shouted. That is worth saying, because I think people expect these things to look like a courtroom drama, and it was more like watching a slow machine do exactly what it was built to do. Tessa Monroe presented first, and it took her 20 minutes. Rains Apiary is a lawful agricultural use in full compliance with county code, verified by field inspection. The Rains parcel lies entirely outside Cedar Hollow Estates and is not subject to its covenants. No easement, lease, license, or development agreement affecting the parcel appears anywhere in the recorded chain of title. The approved resort site plan incorporates 12.9 acres of the Rains parcel as a permanent agricultural and open space buffer. If that acreage is excluded, the project fails the minimum open space ratio. 2 structures fall inside the required agricultural setback, and total development density exceeds the approved maximum. And Condition 14 of the original grant requires the buffer to remain under the applicant's legal control for the operational life of the project, a condition that has never at any time been satisfied. The resort's attorney asked for 120 days to submit a revised plan under the existing approval. He was careful and reasonable, and he did not blame anybody, and I thought he handled a bad hand about as well as it could be handled. Then Mallory Vance spoke, and she made her last mistake. She had signed up to speak on behalf of the association, and she went up with the same posture she had brought to my gate in July, and she told the commission that the community's investment should not be undone over what she called an outdated bee farm. She said it in that voice, the one that assumes everyone in the room agrees with her about what matters and what does not, and I watched the woman on the far left of the dais put down her pen. Mrs. Vance, the commissioner said, you just referred to Mr. Raines's apiary as outdated. How long has it existed relative to the resort? Mallory said she did not have that figure. Approximately, the commissioner said. Mallory said the exact duration was not the point. The commissioner said the record indicates the parcel has been in continuous agricultural use since 1954 and that the apiary has operated there for more than 3 decades, which is roughly 30 years longer than the resort has existed as a concept. Then she said, and I have not forgotten a word of it, this commission does not evaluate whether a lawful use is fashionable. Thank you, Mrs. Vance. And they called me last. I said, I am not asking this commission to shut the resort down. I never asked anyone to build a resort around my land, and I have not asked for it to be taken away. I am asking for one thing, which is that people stop using my property as though it belongs to them. That is all this ever was. Then I put Mallory's nuisance letter on the table in front of the clerk. Mrs. Vance wanted the county to come look at my land, I said. The county came and looked. I do not believe she liked what they found. They deliberated for 40 minutes. When they came back, the decision was read out in the flat language these things always use, and it took a moment for the room to translate it. The conditional land use approval for Cedar Hollow Resort and Spa was suspended and remanded. The applicant would be required to submit an entirely new site plan, based solely on acreage under its own legal control, and to reapply for approval of the unbuilt phases from the beginning. The completed lodge and the first cabin cluster could operate. Everything else went back to square one. Mallory sat very still through all of it. She did not look at me, and she did not look at Grant. The man she had described as a nuisance beekeeper had just turned out to be the one landowner her entire project could not go around, and she had been the person who introduced us all to that fact. Grant Holloway announced the redesign in October. Fewer cabins, 32 instead of 40. The spa wing pulled back 90 feet from the western boundary, the parking reconfigured to sit behind the lodge instead of beside it, and a new internal open space buffer carved out of the resort's own acreage, which cost them buildable land they had planned to sell as cottage lots. He told a homeowners meeting that the changes would add substantially to project cost and roughly 18 months to the schedule. He also said, and I did not expect this, that the error had been his firm's and no one else's. I gained a small amount of respect for him that day, and I have not lost it since. Mallory resigned 3 days before the recall vote. The petition had already collected enough signatures to make the outcome certain, and I think she preferred stepping down to being removed, which is a very human thing, and the only choice in this whole business I would have made the same way. Her resignation letter cited a desire to focus on personal matters. She kept her house. Nobody took anything from her but the thing she had actually been protecting the entire time, which was the authority to decide what belonged here and what did not. She came out to the apiary one last time in November on a cold, clear afternoon when I was wrapping hives for winter. She did not come through the gate. She stood on the other side of it in a wool coat with her hands in her pockets and waited until I walked down to her. "You win," she said. "No," I said, "I have exactly the same amount of land I had before you showed up, not 1 acre more. The only thing that changed is that you finally looked at it." She did not apologize, and I did not expect her to. She stood there another moment looking out over the boxes with their weathered lids and the creek going silver behind them in the low sun, and I could not tell you what she saw. Then she walked back to the SUV and drove down my gravel for the last time. And I went back to work because there were 30 hives left to wrap and the temperature was dropping. The resort got its new approval in the spring, smaller and pulled back from my line, and it opened that summer with 32 cabins and a spa that faces east now instead of west. It seems to be doing fine. The lodge is full most weekends and the county road has more traffic than it used to, and I have gotten used to the sound. The interesting part came in April when the new association board reached out to me. Dean Prescott was on it, which did not surprise me. They did not come to pressure me about anything. They came to ask whether Rain's Apiary would supply honey for the resort gift shop and the lodge breakfast service local product, my label, my name on the jar. I did not say yes right away. I took 3 weeks, and I took them because I wanted to read every line of what they put in front of me, and because I have learned that the speed at which you agree to something tells people how carefully you are going to hold them to it. I had Warren look at the draft. Then I signed an ordinary wholesale supply contract at a fair price, with one condition I insisted on in writing. Not one clause in that agreement grants the association, the resort, or any successor any right of access, control, review, or approval over my land or my apiary operations. They agreed to it without much argument. I think by then everybody understood why I asked. I put up a new sign at the gate that spring, cedar boards, routed letters, nothing fancy. It reads Rain's Apiary, and underneath that, established before Cedar Hollow. It is not there to needle anybody, whatever it might look like from the road. It is there because history does not begin on the day wealthy people build a stone gate and hang a bronze plaque on it, and because there is a particular kind of forgetting that happens when a place gets expensive, where everything that came before starts to look like clutter that somebody neglected to clear away. My grandfather cleared that ground with a mule. My father held it through years when the honey barely covered the sugar. I would rather have it stated on a board at the gate than have to say it out loud in a folding chair at a clubhouse meeting again. Late last summer, I was standing in the middle of the yard at the end of a long day with the light going orange across the tops of the boxes, and I could see 2 guests up on the resort ridge with a camera pointed in my direction, not at me, at the bees. There is a line in the resort's brochure now in the section about the grounds describing the adjoining property as a local pollinator habitat and noting that the honey served at breakfast is produced there. Same boxes, same rows. Same thing Mallory Vance photographed in flat gray light and put on a screen as evidence of blight, now printed in color on good paper as an amenity. The bees have no idea any of this happened. They did not attend a single meeting. They did not read one page of a site plan or care which name was on the deed underneath the clover they were working. They just went out every morning and came back every evening, and while they did it, the woman who called them a nuisance managed to talk herself out of a resort expansion and a presidency. Mallory wanted the county to decide whether my bee yard belonged in this place. In the end, the county answered that question. She just never realized she had pointed them at the wrong piece of land.